Miss Sherry Brandt, partner Dixon Wright. Sherry has a commercial real estate, renewable energy, and Aboriginal law practice. Sherry provides strategic counsel to several First Nations industry clients seeking to develop projects with First Nations and to understand and address Aboriginal rights and interests. Sherry has been named one of the Lexperts magazine's Rising Stars leading lawyers under 40. I'd also like to point out, as a member of the Mohawks, the Bay of Quinte, and with the family of Wikamekong First Nation on Manitoulin Island, Sherry brings a profound understanding of the opportunities and challenges that both Indigenous people and Indigenous proponents face. I'd like to thank her so much for participating and leading this discussion on this very important issue. I give you Sherry Brandt.
Thank you so much. We have a great panel for you today. We have our distinguished guests. What I'm going to do first is just introduce our next topic, which is on the challenges to the fiscal relationship. I'm going to introduce to you somebody who probably doesn't need an introduction, but I think it's great to understand always understand what Robert Louie has been doing and how he's been contributing to this dialogue. So Robert Louie is from Westbank First Nation. As everybody knows, he was a chief for the past 24 years, and he now has a recent appointment as Indigenous Managing Director to a company called Dunhill Group of Companies, and they're involved in the construction and energy business. Chief Louie has served on numerous boards and companies and has special appointments over the past 30 years. He has extensive experience in real estate development and is focused on working with First Nations primarily through land matters throughout Canada. Robert is the chairman of the First Nations Lands Advisory Board for the past 26 years, and he's been instrumental in getting First Nations into incremental self-governance. You'll also note that Robert is a former practicing lawyer. He specialized in Native law and was the summer law instructor at the University of Saskatchewan. He is also a former elected member of the BC First Nations Summit Task Group and was involved in BC treaty negotiations representing First Nations. You'll also see in the bio that Robert has served on so many boards and has been appointed to many has had many incredible appointments throughout the years, and so we're really pleased to have him speak with you today about the challenges to fiscal relationships. He's going to share with you his information on barriers and what he sees are some ideas that we can focus on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sherry, and good afternoon to everyone. I know we're the last group up here, so I'm pleasantly surprised that most of you are still here, so thank you very much for that. I wish to firstly acknowledge the Creator and the ancestors of these beautiful, beautiful lands. My arms and hands go up to the Creator and to the ancestors. I also give acknowledgement to the Mississaugas, to the Ojibwe peoples, Mississaugas of New Credit, to the Ontario Chiefs of this province. Thank you very much for having us in your traditional territories. I wish to also acknowledge my fellow panelists, and I look forward to their contribution. I've had the pleasure and the opportunity to sit through most of the day and heard, I think, all of the presentations. And I think the commonality is pretty much the same. I think that we all feel that there has to be something different. Status quo is not the way to go. We have to make some changes. We're talking about a new fiscal relationship. We're talking about a need that Aboriginal peoples, that we need to happen quicker than later. Things are dragging on far, far too long. I wish to acknowledge as well my colleague, Bill Henderson, sitting over there in the mid-table. He's our legal counsel for the First Nation land management process. Bill has been with us now since its inception. So Bill has a lot of legal extensive background, and since he is in Toronto, lives here, he volunteered his time to be here to answer legal questions should they arise following the presentation today. So thank you very much, Bill, for that. So I'd like to maybe touch upon the development of this new fiscal relationship and look at what's the foundation and go down through a couple of, I think, basic points. Firstly, foundation of a new fiscal relationship is, of course, effective relationship is trust and mutual respect. There's no question that has to happen. And for a workable fiscal relationship, First Nations need to be treated and recognized as governments. That is absolutely fundamentally clear. And for Aboriginal peoples in Canada, this requires some form of reconciliation. And I think this is the same message that you've heard throughout today. As well, intergovernmental fiscal relations requires some form of decentralization, and it requires financial responsibility at all levels. First Nations as governments must have access to adequate levels of revenues. That has to happen. Therefore, First Nations must have the ability to raise those revenues, and it should include some form of revenue sharing. There must be a certain amount of autonomy given to First Nations, both to raise the monies and to expend the monies. So a renewal relationship is important to economic growth of Canada, and the cost of doing nothing, of course, is not acceptable. So a question then rises, what the new fiscal relationship should look like. And again, I think we've heard the previous speakers. When Charlie Coffey mentioned this morning that New Zealand finally figured out they have to share the pie, I think that has a lot of merit in there. Former Premier Bob Rae mentioned that foundation must be fiscal equality. Equality has to be a buzzword and key. And to be a government, you need the capacity to raise monies, you need land, and you need jurisdiction. I heard the regional chief, Isidore Day, say that the Indian Act has to be dismantled, that we need to build upon an institution, and it has to be our own authority. We have to transfer bureaucracy to First Nation control, and we, as Aboriginal peoples, have to deliver to our peoples. So, I know that my work has been over several decades with First Nation land management. We have been a success story, I believe, in Canada, and I'm proud of the First Nations who are involved. We have 73 First Nations who have passed land codes to date and have that incremental form of self-government. We are dealing either directly or indirectly with 205 First Nations across Canada. We are providing a return back to government 10 times what they're providing to us. So it's an investment into us to have that jurisdiction to manage our own lands and our own resources. So it is certainly a success story. So it's clear in my mind that new fiscal relationship must be defined by a true nation-to-nation government. And that requires government to share. The outside federal, provincial governments, they must learn and they must commit to share. The First Nations recognized jurisdiction of Section 35 in the modern treaty, all of that has to be recognized and put in place. Again, and you've heard the previous speakers mention that it's not working. How many times do we have to stand here together and say it's not working? Government has to listen. And funding is something that has to happen to truly address the needs. The backlogs, the comparability, the infrastructure, the services, the training and capacity, and the economic growth. All are significant factors that funding has to address, and it has to do so immediately. If that's done, then we're going to reach equality. The First Nation control and accountability to First Nations. That is fundamentally key. So with all of this comes jurisdiction. And that jurisdiction must be properly handled. And again, like all governments, all First Nations and all First Nation groups must be equally accountable. And I think there's no getting away from that. We all must be fiscally prudent. We must understand what has to be done and act and be governments. The supporting organizations and institutes has to be developed. There's no question. I agree with what Harold Calla had mentioned earlier, that there has to be some form of standards, and those standards have to be implemented right across this nation. Those are fundamentally important aspects. And to listen to the Auditor General, I wish he were an elected member of Parliament, and I wish his views could be heard, because I think we would have some movement. When he talks about problem solving and political will, I'm glad at least his department to this date, has made those fundamental statements. And I agree, and I think we all understand there has not been movement in this country, and that time has got to change. So, carrying on with the various questions, and I've kind of listed some of the questions that were contained in the brochure. And I hope I had the right brochure when I put some of the answers down, or some of my thoughts down. The first question I saw was, are Indigenous nations empowered with the full resources they need to achieve self-government? Obvious answer, no. There has to be expansion of the Aboriginal land and resource base. There must be a more defined and recognized Aboriginal order of government, having clear fiscal powers. There must be adequate financial and human resources to ensure the government capacity of First Nation meets the needs of its peoples. And for those First Nations that have various levels of self-government jurisdiction, then there's only a partial answer that might touch upon yes. So in that category, I've listed some of the communities in Canada, First Nations with self-government agreements. My community at Westbank has done extraordinarily well with self-government. And there are other communities in negotiations right now, and I think that you'll find as time moves on, those communities can and will achieve better autonomy, better fiscal relationships, but it's only partially there at this point in time. First Nations with modern-day treaties, including self-government authorities, yes, I think they're moving ahead. First Nations with land codes under the Framework Agreement on First Nation land management. I definitely know our group there is moving ahead, and moving ahead at an extraordinary pace, as well as those First Nations that are currently fiscally wealthy. And there's not too many of those, and I think we're all aware of it. In all these categories, though, with that partial yes of these First Nations that are partially capable, there still has to be more that has to be done. My experience to date relates mainly to the Land Code, the Framework Agreement, First Nations, and self-government, and I'll primarily focus on those areas. Firstly, with Land Code First Nations. Land Code First Nations are incrementally self-governing once they pass their land codes. As I mentioned, we have 73 land codes passed to date from coast to coast. 3 of those 73 have gone on to other forms of self-government or modern-day treaties. The limitations under the Framework Agreement and the Self-Government Agreement is that the land management jurisdiction only applies to reserve lands. Can it be expanded? I think the answer is yes. We're looking at some amendments now with the federal government, and we're hopeful that they'll take place and we'll have some real solid discussions. It won't happen this year, we understand, but 2018 and forward, we look towards future amendments that will expand potentially the jurisdiction under land management to include maybe lands off of the reserve lands. And that's the problem. We're limited fiscally with the reserve lands. However, even in that limited capacity, we are still making the headway and are raising hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars collectively across this country that benefits all Canadians, including our First Nation members. So expansion is something that we're looking forward in the future. Another question I saw there was, what resources do communities need to achieve their self-governance aspirations? So the main resource must include, again, their governance jurisdiction. And again, that must have some form of applicability not only over reserve lands, but traditional territories or Aboriginal title-claimed lands. For proper fiscal management, the First Nation and the Aboriginal groups must have the capability to raise monies. We have to have that capacity. And it has to include, again, some form of revenue sharing of resources. That is a must. If we're going to have equality, these are just fundamental things that have to be hammered home. The resource of knowledge, the resource of experience, the resource of capability to manage the lands and resources is also crucial. We have to realize that with being a government comes a lot of responsibility, and we're going to have to get there. I don't believe all First Nations are there yet, and I think we need to develop institutes and programs and services that will help in that knowledge, learning, and that experience to get all of our peoples at the level to properly manage their lands and their resources. I think monies have to be put into the kitty. There has to be a kickstart to the First Nations in this whole process. And I think government has to get there, and they have to lay out some of those dollars so that we can actually move ahead at the speed of business. So it leads to us, and you've heard this again today, a stable and reliable funding base. It is absolutely imperative to deal with the issues of social disparity that we all face as First Nation leaders and as peoples, and the need there to provide services to our community members, and the services needed to promote and foster economic development. A new form of fiscal transfer is needed to provide the predictability of revenues instead of contribution and grants. Question number 3. This question is as follows. What are the persisting barriers, legal, political, institutional, that are impeding a new form of relationship? And I think that's a whole myriad of areas. From a political and monetary sense, we've heard governments and how they deal with fiscal restraint and how they cut back dollars. I think those government budget restraints and that cutback and the fiscal restraints because of the overall economy poses a significant barrier. And it's raising of monies that's needed by government, and they're looking after their own programs. They're looking after the national issues, but that restrains us. And I think it has to be viewed differently, looked at differently, because that is what will bring the returns. 10 times maybe more, the return of if investments were made in First Nations and First Nation and Aboriginal governments across this country. I think another restraint, of course, is the downturn in the economy. We've seen a roller coaster in the economy, and I think that puts barriers in place, and it definitely must affect the federal and provincial governments, and it must affect the way that they dole out the dollars. And I think that is part of the barrier that we're facing. I think we see a barrier when government changes leadership, federally and provincially. I think you heard the Auditor General talk about various ministries and deputy ministers changing over a period of 5 years. I think he mentioned in 5 years, 4 deputy ministers changed. That is a huge problem. It's a huge problem when government goes through its election process, the changes in ministers, because the views and the track changes. And I think that has to fundamentally change. There has to be a commitment by whatever government comes to power to make this a reality. Because if it can become a reality, we can become fiscally responsible, and there will be equality, and there will be an investment return back to the Canadians and to the economy far better than having the cutbacks or non-action. The government's actual willingness to engage with First Nations and Aboriginal leadership to actually enter into fiscal relationships. And I think you've heard Harold Kalla talk about the treaty negotiations in British Columbia. I was fortunate enough to be involved in those negotiations with the First Nations Summit for 4 years. I saw the mandates that were being proposed. We fought to change the mandates, yet the attitude of both federal and provincial of that time was no. Absolutely no. No movement. And that's why there is no treaties as to the numbers that they should be. And that's why we are so almost stalled with this new modern-day treaty-making process. That is the attitudes that have to change, and mandate of government has to change. I truly believe that governments feel it's cheaper simply to drag things out, not deal with it, leave it for someone else. And I believe that that is exactly the motivation that's happened in the past. Hopefully governments will change. If we're going to have relationship changes, that attitude better change. There is no dedicated entity within the federal and provincial government to manage the relationship. And again, That's something that has to happen. There has to have some sort of an overall review done both at the federal and provincial levels to have entities that are dedicated to follow through. Doesn't matter the change in governments, provincially or federally, that this mandate is followed through. There has to be that. And, of course, the simple issues that seem simple, the program caps at 2%. We have a long ways to catch up, and we're starting from way behind the goalposts. I've been told I have 5 minutes. I'm going to have to hustle a little bit here, so I apologize. Part of the dilemma is being at the end of the day, I guess. Barriers, quickly, own source revenue constraints, governments unwilling to transfer fiscal powers, overlapping territories. That is a big issue. First Nations in British Columbia were trying to finalize the treaty process, settle land claims. We have overlapping territories. We need to settle those issues among ourselves. And that's a responsibility that we have as nations and as leaders. The legal, all kinds of issues, ownership of minerals and resources. The existing legislation and regulations make this problematic. When you look at Nova Scotia, they claimed all of the waters. We're dealing with one of the First Nations in Nova Scotia right now. They want their water jurisdiction rights, yet the Nova Scotia says, no, we control the water. How is that going to be fiscally responsible if that's how government's going to act? The minerals and subsurface rights and so forth, the precious metals, the giving out of all these mineral claims and so forth. If that's all done without First Nation involvement, how the heck are we going to have equality? Just not going to happen. We know that there's provincial proprietary rights with Section 109 of the Constitution. We know that the Constitution was put in place that gives underlying ownership of the provincial crown in the provinces, subject to trusts existing, subject to any interest other than that of the province. And we have issues surrounding there, which, given the time here, I'm going to just skip a number of these points. Maybe institutional barriers. There are few institutional programs set up to help First Nations specifically to gain the capacity to become fiscally responsible, knowledgeable, and capable to run themselves as governments. Again, those programs and that support has to be put in place. There is a lack of training programs, and there's a lack of dollars contributed for that to happen. And many First Nations, I believe, when they look at institutions, are sometimes bothered by having simple form of an institution. Is that really what we want? I think it's going to have to be carefully done. Because institutions, quite often, are subject to public scrutiny. They're subject to having commissioners and board of directors subject to constant change. That has to be really looked at carefully if we're going to have institutions having this overall management responsibility. And this may not sit well with many of the communities I know and Aboriginal groups, and this could, in fact, be a barrier. Capital infrastructure, certainly insufficient. First Nations cannot have and do not have the infrastructure necessary to meet the needs of their capital requirements on their reserve. They're not like municipalities. We don't have the budgets and the dollars allocated. That has to happen. I think I'm going to have to give up. I've got several more pages, but I think I've run out of time. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm sorry about that, but thank you for your attention. Lim Lim.